Yes, hello to everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
That's very good. Thank you. And yeah, I'm happy to do the presentation on bilateral labor migration agreements and international cooperation in the development, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. My name is Vasily Yuzhann. I'm representing IOM, and I'm heading the unit on labor and human mobility facilitation in IOM Geneva. And well, I have over 20 years of experience in the area of migration, mainly focusing on the international migration law, international human rights law, and international law in general, international humanitarian law as well. So. First of all, I think that bilateral labor migration agreements are one of the important tools that may support effective implementation of cooperation between states in the area of migration, labor migration. First of all, I would like to stop quickly on the terminology so that we speak the same language. Perhaps the majority of the colleagues present at the table in the room, they know well the abbreviation BLAs, bilateral labor agreements. However, just recently, there is a bit of a different abbreviation came into the play, which is bilateral labor migration agreements. You see the M there in the abbreviation, which represents migration. So, in fact, basically, we use the term BLMA, bilateral labor migration agreement, as an overarching term that covers all types of agreements between two or maybe more countries regulating labor migration. That includes classical BLA, bilateral labor agreements, which in fact is quite a well-established type of agreements. It is first usually binding, and second, there is existing module or model of this agreement provided by the or recommended by the international law. I'll speak about it a little bit later. The BLMAs also include memoranda of understanding. These are the BLAs, but normally having non-binding or sometimes framework nature. And these may be other agreements that may include specific agreements between ministries and agencies on specific aspects of labor migration or concerning specific professions or occupations. Let's say teachers, let's say agricultural workers, let's say manufacturing workers, and others. Or these can be also the framework agreements that include labor migration along other topics, such as, agreement on cooperation on irregular migration, on readmission, on economic development. Well, now I would like to mention, and I really thank the previous speaker referring to the international law. I will keep it short. All the BLMAs, bilateral labor migration agreements, they need to be based on international and regional standards. I will mention just, the international ones, the human rights instruments, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but particularly important role plays the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families. Apart from human rights instruments, there are labor standards, and a number of ILO conventions that are relevant and underpin the frameworks of the BLMAs. You can see in the brackets the underlined numbers, those which are directly relevant to migration, number 97, 143 related to migrant workers, 181 related to the recruitment agencies, 189 related to the domestic workers. But there are other instruments which are in the ILO which are very important. Conventions related to the minimum age of employment, conventions related to the prohibition of forced labor, convention related to the unionization and the ability rights to take part in the unions and so on. Apart from these, other branches of law are very important. Transnational organized criminal law. For instance, the protocols that accompany transnational organized criminal law convention, that is the protocol against trafficking, and another one is protocol against smuggling. The global frameworks are hugely important. And here we mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and basically the idea, of course, that the BLMAs should strive to help origin and destination countries to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, to provide contribution to employment opportunities, rise and increase of employment opportunities, education and training, poverty reduction, access to rights and services. And another important global framework is the Global Compact on Migration. And it does not have a specific objective on bilateral labor migration agreements, but it refers to bilateral cooperation and refers to bilateral labor migration agreements in few objectives. We will come to the implementation of the Global Compact for migration a bit later. Now, before I proceed to international cooperation, I would like to say why BLMAs are important. Of course, first of all, this is a good platform. This is a good cooperation framework that is there to protect better the rights of migrant workers and establish the cooperation mechanisms between states, not only to manage labor migration, but also to ensure the access to rights and services by the migrant workers, and importantly, to the members of their families. However, it should be an effective instrument. And importantly, we have to realize and make it clear that we may have an excellent bilateral labor migration agreement, but the underpinning, the fundamental part which will serve for its effective implementation is developed effective migration policies and laws at origin and destination side. Without them, the bilateral labor migration agreements will not be functioning properly and effectively. So they will only be effective when policies and laws and procedures. So yet it is one of the instruments, the BLMAs are one of the instruments that support states in regulation labor mobility, along with many other instruments like agreements on trade and services, like partnerships on skills mobility, like partnerships on skills development. Many other instruments are there. So we need to keep in mind that BLMAs are one of the instruments. And there is a need for synchronization of BLMAs along the commitments states are taking on each other in bilateral cooperation, but at the same time in aligning BLMAs and labor mobility policy with other policies on trade, policies on education, policies on development, policies on sectoral development. Another important aspect is BLMAs, and the previous speaker also touched this issue. BLMAs are effective when they foresee the multi-stakeholder engagement. And here we speak not only, we speak the multi-stakeholder engagement on the side, from the side of the government, that does not only include the usual involved ministries such as Foreign Affairs and Labor, but what is more difficult, because sometimes the government structure differs from country to country with respect to agencies that are involved into migration management. That may be the Ministry of Interior, that may be the Ministry of Labor, that may be other ministries, but at the same time, that are also education, training institutions, ministries of economic development. And final point, BLMAs should be transparent and known to all the stakeholders. And with respect to multi-stakeholder engagement, I would like also to mention the importance of inclusion into the discussions, the private sector and non-governmental sector. So, because these are crucial and important stakeholders. Issue. IOM itself has developed a number of tools. You can see on this slide just one of them, the tool for and instruments for the support of the BLMA development in the SADC region, Southern African Development Community, but applicable in all other regions. That's developed in 2016, suggests multilateral approach, underlines the importance of comprehensive approach, and includes issues related to monitoring and evaluation of the BLMAs. Another good example of international cooperation is ILO-IOM tool for the development, drafting, negotiation, monitoring, and implementation of the bilateral labor migration agreements. This tool touches all the stages of the BLMAs, which you see on this slide, and propose modalities for the cooperation and interaction between different stakeholders on government level and in wider perspective. At each stage of the bilateral labor migration agreement implementation, also linked closely to the migration continuum, starting with the preparation for migration at the origin side, along with employment, travel and employment and in the destination, and return and reintegration or onward migration. There are some other literature coming from OECD and ILO. I will just keep this slide for your information. And now we'll mention an important cooperation which is going on the global level for the support states in the implementation of the Global Compact on for migration. You know that to assist governments to implement the GCM, the UN formed the United Nations Network on Migration, and there are working groups that consist that compose the vehicle for the implementation of the GCM, and that thematically grouped according different priorities set up by the UN member states and international organizations. And one of the working groups of the Global Compact UN Migration Network is related to the development of the guidance, a global guidance on BLMAs. It is this working group under the ILO-IOM core leadership, with the involvement of other stakeholders on the international level, such as OECD. The organizations coming up with the sector perspective, like World Health Organization, FAO, UN Women, focusing on gender aspects, and UNMGCI, the youth group, focusing on perspective from the youth angle. Social partners are taking part, of course, in this working group: academia, civil society, and NGOs. And as I mentioned, the idea is to develop the global guidance. The partners within the working group are in constant communication on its progress with the member states of the UN and present its work. The partners develop the basis for the global guidance, which rests on the international law and principles, which I mentioned before. And now we have already pre-final draft of the global guidance, a very detailed document focusing on, again, different steps of the life cycle of a BLMA, and suggesting involvement of different stakeholders at different steps of the life cycle of a BLMA, and coming up with examples of good BLMAs, but also with the suggestions on the formulation of the steering committees that are there to implement the BLMA and taking into account different other aspects. And well, soon the global guidance will be prepared or ready for the presentation to the member states, and the other step forward would be testing it, pilot testing with interested governments along interested or selected corridors. I think I will stop here. Would rather reserve some time for questions and queries. And thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.